A hospital waiting room. 3 in the morning. The fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song to no one. The clock ticks. 3 hours and 47 minutes have passed. Long enough for people to forget he's there. Somewhere across the city, a 12-year-old girl is waking up to an empty apartment, checking her phone, waiting for a message that hasn't come. You're watching this because something in your gut knows what's coming. That moment when the person everyone ignores finally disappears, and the world feels the damage all at once. For 12 years, there was a man who arrived at Riverside Elementary every morning at 7:15 a.m. Not 7:16, not 7:14. The same car, same entrance, same moment when he'd unlock the gate to the playground before the staff did. The principal never asked who had given him the key. The teachers didn't question why the equipment was organized, why the sandbox was raked, why the safety mats had been checked before anyone arrived to use them. He simply appeared. He simply did the work. He simply left. And everyone assumed that was how things were supposed to be. His name was Robert Washington. He had been born in a city that didn't have enough resources to care for children like him, children whose mothers couldn't afford to stay, who had to choose between work and presence, because those were the only two options the world offered. His father was a ghost story, someone his mother mentioned only in whispers, usually after whiskey, usually with a sadness that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with timing. Robert learned early that being a black man meant working twice as hard for half the recognition. He learned this in school, where teachers called on him less. He learned this at the grocery store, where eyes followed him. He learned this in every interaction that taught him his existence was provisional, temporary, subject to revision. And he learned it again when Malia was born, and he realized he would have to be two parents, the father and the mother both, the presence and the protector, the voice and the silence. When his daughter was born, when he was 24 years old and unprepared in every way except the one that mattered, he made a different kind of promise. Not to God, not to anyone who could witness it, just to the 8-pound girl who had his eyes and her mother's determination. He promised to be the thing his own father never was. He promised to come back. Her name was Malia. She had his eyes. She had his tendency toward silence, toward watching, toward understanding people's moods before they understood them themselves. She had his hands, large hands that made her look older than she was, hands she sometimes hid in her pockets because other kids made jokes about girls with big hands. Malia was 3 years old when her mother left. She remembered the suitcases. She remembered the smell of her mother's perfume in the doorway. She didn't remember the argument, but she remembered the silence that followed it, a silence that told her that her mother had chosen something else, and she remembered asking, in the small voice of a child who was beginning to understand that people could disappear, "Is Daddy leaving too?" Robert never said a word against the woman who left him with a daughter and no instructions. He simply looked at Malia, at the fear in her eyes, and made another promise. He simply held her and said, "No, never. I'm always coming back." Robert never said a word against the woman who left him with a daughter and no instructions. He simply looked at Malia and began the arithmetic of survival. 2 jobs, flexible hours, a babysitter, Marcus's aunt, who took money under the table because she worked in a system that didn't officially recognize her labor. When Malia started kindergarten, everything changed. Robert began arriving at Riverside Elementary at 7:15 every morning. He didn't have a job there. The school didn't pay him. He came because Malia was anxious about transitions, because she needed to see him before school started, because watching him check the playground made her believe the world was safe. He would find her in the line of students waiting for the doors to open. He would catch her eye. He would nod once, a small gesture that meant, "I'm here. You're safe. I'm not leaving." Then he'd disappear into the landscape of the school grounds, like he'd always been part of it. By the time Malia was 8, Robert had a routine that was so normal nobody questioned it anymore. He arrived at the school, walked the perimeter, checked the equipment, raked the sand where the youngest children played, oiled the hinges so no child would be startled, and swept the paths clean. He did this work with the attention of someone performing a sacred task, though the task was simply, keep this place safe for my daughter. One morning, when Malia was 10, the gate was locked from the inside, a new security policy. Robert stood on the other side of the fence, his tools in his hands, unable to reach the playground he had maintained for 8 years. He waited. No one came to let him in. He called the school. Principal Whitmore's voice on the phone was pleasant but firm. "We need to follow protocol, Mr. Washington. You'll have to fill out a new access form. It could take a week or two." A week, 2 weeks. Robert thought about the equipment that wouldn't be checked. He thought about Malia, who would arrive at school and not see him on the playground, who would wonder if something had changed. He filled out the form. He was approved 3 days later. But something had shifted. He had discovered that his presence, his access, his right to care for the space where his daughter spent her days, all of it was temporary. All of it could be revoked. There was a teacher named Mrs. Chen who noticed. She noticed the way he moved through space, the care in his gestures, the particular gentleness he brought to checking the monkey bars. She noticed that he never expected thanks. She noticed that he only ever looked at one place, the classroom where Malia sat, visible through the window. And she noticed on the day after the gate lockout the slight hesitation in his movements, the way he touched the equipment as if he was asking permission. One morning, she stopped him. "Mr. Washington, why do you do this?" He paused. He was holding a rake. The sun was just rising, turning the grass gold. "Because the world doesn't check things for people like us, unless something breaks," he said. "Because if I don't make sure this place is safe, no one else will. Because my daughter sees that I care about something that matters." Mrs. Chen started telling other teachers. Other teachers started noticing him. But notice and change are not the same thing. They thanked him occasionally, offered payment that he refused, brought him coffee that he politely declined. The school's administration, led by a principal named Gerald Whitmore, who wore expensive watches and had conversations about sustainable infrastructure, simply accepted the gift of Robert's labor without ever questioning its source. Robert never asked for anything, so everyone assumed he had everything he needed. What they didn't see was the apartment. 2 bedrooms, one of which Robert rented to a rotating cast of temporary tenants to keep the mortgage paid. The kitchen where he cooked beans and rice and whatever vegetables were on sale, making meals that could stretch across 3 days. The closet where he hung his 4 work shirts and 4 casual shirts, rotating them on a system that ensured they lasted. The moment every month when he sat at the kitchen table with Malia's school papers and the bills and a calculator, doing math that never quite balanced. What they didn't see was the job he kept at night, cleaning offices in the downtown towers while the city slept. 3 nights a week, he'd leave after Malia was asleep, clean until dawn, come home to shower, and then go to the school by 7:15. What they didn't see was the way he held Malia when she had nightmares about her mother not coming back. The way he told her every night that he would always return. The way she would ask each morning, "You came back?" And he would say, "I always come back." When Malia was 9, Robert got sick. Not dramatically sick. Not in a way that seemed serious. A cough that lingered. A fatigue that he attributed to the night cleaning job. He didn't go to a doctor because a doctor meant time away from work, time away from Malia, and money they didn't have. The cough got worse. One morning, he showed up at the school and had to sit down halfway through raking the sandbox. A substitute teacher found him there, breathing heavily, his skin ashen, They called an ambulance. They didn't ask permission. They just called. The hospital kept him for 3 days. Pneumonia, a respiratory infection that had been spreading while he ignored it. Antibiotics and rest, and the kind of care that cost money he didn't have. Malia stayed with Mrs. Chen, the teacher who had noticed him. She stayed in Mrs. Chen's house, in Mrs. Chen's guest room, surrounded by the feeling of not belonging. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat much. She asked every hour if her father had come back yet. On the 3rd day, Robert left the hospital. The doctors told him to rest. He went straight to the school. He couldn't rake. His hands were shaking, but he showed up. He stood at the cold metal gate at 7:15 a.m., and when Malia came around the corner with Mrs. Chen, she stopped. She looked at her father, thin and pale and obviously unwell, and she started crying. He nodded once. "I'm here. You're safe. I'm not leaving." When Malia turned 12, she was old enough to understand what had always been happening. She was old enough to realize that her father's arrival at the school before she did wasn't coincidence. She was old enough to do the math on his work schedule. She was old enough to see the strain in his face, the way his hands trembled on certain mornings, the way he moved like someone carrying something heavy. She also started to understand that the world had divided itself into people who noticed her father and people who profited from his labor without acknowledging it. Principal Whitmore had created a new initiative, Whole Child Development. It featured prominently in the school's glossy new brochure. The brochure highlighted the beautiful playground, the well-maintained equipment, the safe grounds where children could thrive. It did not mention Robert. It did not include a photograph of him. The brochure simply presented the result of his work as if it had been achieved by institutional excellence rather than by a man who came before dawn and did things nobody paid him to do. Robert didn't seem bothered by this. Or if he was, he kept it interior, kept it in the place where he kept his pain. "What matters," he told Malia, "is not that people know what I do. What matters is that you know that I do it, that you know I care about the things in your life, that you understand that love is not a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day." Malia was 12 years old and already too wise for her years. On a Tuesday in March, Robert didn't show up. The gate remained locked. The playground equipment was not checked. The sand was not raked. The paths were not swept. By 7:30 a.m., teachers were noticing the absence. By 8:02 a.m., someone mentioned it to Principal Whitmore. His response was to note that external maintenance was not part of the contractual obligations of the school, and that they would monitor the situation. By Wednesday, a mother with a lawsuit-ready expression pointed out that the sandbox had debris in it, a potential hazard. Another parent mentioned that the equipment hadn't been oiled and squeaked loudly. A third complained about leaves on the path. Principal Whitmore sent an email to the maintenance contractor requesting immediate service. The contractor's quote was $1,400 for an emergency assessment and repairs. Suddenly, the playground had become a problem. Suddenly, what had been normal became unacceptable. Malia went to school knowing something was wrong. She didn't know what, but she knew that the space her father maintained had changed. She could feel it in the air, in the small neglects, in the unnoticed details, in the gap where someone used to be. On Thursday, Mrs. Chen took her aside. "Your father is in the hospital, Malia. He had a collapse at work. He's going to be okay, but he needs to rest." Malia felt the ground shift. She looked out at the playground, at the squeaking equipment, at the unraked sand, at all the small things that had seemed invisible because they had been handled so well. She looked at Principal Whitmore, who was standing near the gate with an expression of mild annoyance that the school's operations were being disrupted by a man he'd never bothered to know. And she understood, for the first time, the full weight of her father's invisibility. Robert spent a week in the hospital. The diagnosis was stress, exhaustion, and a body that had finally stopped cooperating with the demands of survival. The doctor told him to rest, to stop the night cleaning job, to take care of himself. He didn't argue. He nodded. He listened. But he also knew that rest meant less income. Less income meant choosing between Malia's school supplies and the internet bill. It meant the mathematics of survival becoming even more impossible. On the 8th day, when he came home, he found his apartment filled with things. Groceries on the table, a gift card for the pharmacy, cleaning supplies, a note from Mrs. Chen saying that the staff had taken up a collection. He sat on the edge of his bed and cried for the first time in years. Not quietly, not in the controlled way he usually did things, but fully, completely, the way a person cries when the weight of everything finally becomes too much. Malia sat next to him and held his hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For not being able to be stronger." "You are the strongest person I know," she said. And she was 12 years old, and she meant it with the absolute clarity of someone who had been watching him fight his entire life. When Robert returned to the school, 3 weeks later, there was a meeting. Principal Whitmore, the school board, Mrs. Chen, and Robert sitting in a conference room like they were negotiating a treaty. "Mr. Washington," Principal Whitmore began, "the school would like to offer you a position. Part-time groundskeeper, 20 hours per week. It's not much, but it's official recognition for the work you've been doing." Robert heard what was and wasn't being said. They were offering because they had discovered in his absence that his work mattered. They were offering because liability had suddenly become real when he wasn't there to prevent it. "What's the pay?" Robert asked. $16 per hour. He did the math in his head. $320 a week. That was enough to ease some of the pressure. Not enough to change his life, but enough. "I'll need it to be in the evenings," he said, "after school, and I need Malia to be able to come with me sometimes." "Of course," Principal Whitmore agreed, as if this was exactly what he'd been planning all along. By the time Malia turned 14, her father's work at the school was recognized. There were other students now, high school kids who worked with him, who learned from him, who discovered that there was something almost meditative about caring for a space, about making things safe for people you might never meet. Malia didn't need to ask him to come back anymore. She knew without asking that he always would, but something had shifted. The invisibility had cracked, the silence had been broken, the world had finally noticed what it had been taking for granted. Robert's hands, over time, began to shake less. The lines in his face softened slightly. He started to exist in the world in a way that was more than just survival, and Malia grew up knowing that being seen, truly seen, was something that had to be claimed. That value had to be acknowledged. That love without recognition was still love, but recognition made it possible to believe in yourself. Years later, when Malia was in college studying social work, she went back to visit the school. It was summer. The grounds were quiet. She walked across the playground that her father had maintained for 12 years, the equipment that he had checked, the paths that he had swept. She found her father in the maintenance shed, working on the gate hinges, making sure they would turn smoothly when school started again. "I'm writing about you," she told him, "for my thesis, about how invisible labor sustains institutions, and how that invisibility is a choice the institution makes, not a fact about the work." Robert looked up. He set down his tools. "Will you use my name?" "Yes," she said. "I'll use your name." He nodded, and for a moment she saw something in his face that she'd never seen before. Not pride exactly, but something like relief, the relief of finally being named, of finally having his presence acknowledged not as a background feature, but as central to the story. The school commissioned a mural in Robert's honor. It depicts the playground, the equipment, the paths, and in the background, barely visible, a figure checking the gate. The dedication reads, "For the people who make safety invisible, and all of us who have learned to expect it without seeing them." Robert doesn't like the attention, but he doesn't protest it either. He accepts that his invisibility has become its own kind of visibility. Not the kind that makes him uncomfortable, but the kind that finally lets people see what was always there. Malia is a social worker now. She works with working families, with parents who are trying to survive in a system that doesn't want them to. She tells them about her father. She shows them that presence, consistency, and the small acts of care that nobody acknowledges are the actual foundation of everything. She tells them, the world will try to use you without seeing you, but some of us will see, some of us will know, and that will have to be enough. Robert still arrives at Riverside Elementary at 7:15 a.m., not because he has to anymore, not because his presence is invisible, but because the morning light on the playground reminds him of the day he promised a 3-year-old girl that he would always come back. The waiting room is quiet now, not because no one cares, but because someone finally stayed, and he keeps his promises, even when the world forgets why they matter.